And joining me now are Neil Katyal, the acting Solicitor General under President Obama, and Saul Weisenberg, who was Deputy Independent Counsel under Ken Starr. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks.
All right, you're my counselors for this. Neil, let me start with you. We got a lot of open threads here. What is Mueller potentially could still do that the president should be concerned about before submitting this report?
I mean, Mueller can do a lot, so he's only at the, he's done some things. We know he's indicted 37 people and 199 different counts, including Trump's inner circle, people like Michael Flynn, his national security advisor, Paul Manafort, his campaign manager, Michael Cohen, his personal lawyer. So if this is a witch hunt, Mueller's found a coven at this point. And looking forward, there are still targets, the smaller ones like Jerome Corsi, who said he's going to be indicted, expects to be indicted, and then some potentially bigger fish as well, both on the indictment front. And then you have questions about what's the report going to say and the like.
And I want to get to that. And Saul, Rudy Giuliani said he hasn't heard from the special counsel's office now. I think he said in about a month since they turned in the answers to their questions. The lack of communication, should that make the president nervous?
I don't think it should make him nervous, but in answer to one of your questions to Neil, I think that it's difficult for me to imagine that, let's take Donald Trump Jr. If Mueller was going to indict Donald Trump Jr., it's difficult for me to imagine that he would wait until after a report was filed to do that. So I think once that report is filed, there won't be any more indictments, I think, from Mueller's shop, as opposed to Southern District of New York.
That's a different story.
That's a different story. And keep in mind, there are a lot of people who've been indicted and there are a lot of people who pled guilty. But given Mueller's original charge, there's no American citizen living here, nobody associated with the Trump campaign that's been indicted for criminally conspiring with the Russians with respect to that campaign.
And I just want to reinforce, you expect if Mueller is going to have more indictments, they're going to come before this report. So if there's lying to Congress indictments, things like that, that would come before the report.
They would be returned. Whether or not they'll be revealed, I don't know, but they'll be returned.
Neil, if there was the big election conspiracy to be charged, if he was going to charge this sort of giant election conspiracy, would we already have seen that charge, or would that be the grand finale?
No, it could be coming, and it could be something that actually someone else indicts, not Mueller. Mueller might do the setup piece for it. But look, we already have some of that information. I mean, Mueller has indicted Roger Stone for conspiring with WikiLeaks, which is a Russian front. He indicted Papadopoulos for lying about meeting with Russian agents even before this email scandal became known in April 2016. So we're starting to already see the outlines of a Mueller report that does look like he is alleging some sort of conspiracy. So I disagree with my friend Saul here when he says, oh, there's nothing in these indictments about a Russian collusion, Russian conspiracy. There is.
Well, there are things in the indictment, but nobody has been indicted for actually conspiring with the Russians to violate the criminal law in connection with the investigation. They've been indicted for obstruction of justice. They've been indicted for witness tampering, and a lot of it relates to questions about the Russians. And that's something everybody should be concerned about and wonder about. But in terms of his original charge, and I'm not saying it isn't going to happen, I'm just saying it's a reality. It hasn't happened.
Is there
yet.
a chance that, does obstruction prove the collusion?
Oh, I mean,
potentially, in your mind?
It sure comes pretty close. It's a really thin reed to say, oh, you've been indicted for obstruction of justice about Russian collusion and not the Russian collusion itself. I mean, some people denigrate these as so-called process crimes, but anyone in law enforcement knows these are really crucial crimes because it does obscure the search for the truth. Look at Mueller and look at Manafort and how much he's been lying and delaying the Mueller investigation by lying to him.
Where do you interpret that? How much should we interpret obstruction as? Well, that might be some evidence of collusion if they're obstructing it, the investigation.
I don't denigrate it at all. I think it's serious, and I think you should wonder why people lie. It's an interesting feature of this administration that a lot of people connected with it lie when there's no apparent reason to lie. I mean, take a look at Michael Flynn. He had already told people in the administration that he was going to talk to the Russians in the transition period.
And he apparently told Andy McCabe he knew they were listening.
And then he reads a story in the Washington Post that says he's under investigation for the Logan Act and tells something that allegedly is untrue to Vice President Pence and then lies to the government about it. Why? Why? That's a big, it's a big mystery why some of the people did lie. But yes, we should absolutely be concerned about it.
All right, I want to talk about the report. Neil, you wrote the regulations now about what these reports. So let me put up number one, Mueller's report to Barr. And here's what it says in the regulation. At the conclusion of the special counsel's work, he or she shall provide the Attorney General with a confidential report explaining the prosecution or declination decisions reached by the special counsel. Confidential report. That means no one's going to see it. What was your intent?
Yeah, so the idea was there was going to be law enforcement sensitive material in there, and in general you wanted that report to be confidential. However, when you're dealing with potential wrongdoing by the President of the United States, if Mueller finds information out that says this, absolutely the Attorney General here, Barr, has the discretion to turn that report over to Congress, and indeed he has to. The overall intent of the regulations, it's said time and time again, is public confidence in the administration of justice, and any sort of suppressed report about presidential wrongdoing will flunk that test.
Now, Saul, let me read part 2 here, which is Barr to Congress, because I'm curious how you would interpret this and how you think Bill Barr might interpret this. It says this: the Attorney General will notify the chairman and ranking minority member of the Judiciary Committees of each House of Congress with an explanation upon conclusion of the special counsel's investigation. An explanation could be anything. How do you think Bill Barr will interpret that?
Well, you know, it's an interesting conflict potentially between the plain language of the regulations and the intent of the framer here, who sees a little more in it maybe than the plain language. I think Barr has great discretion as to how much he's going to reveal, but he's already said, I'm going to reveal as much as I can. And one of the interesting questions is, how will Mueller present his report to Barr? Because Mueller, in my opinion, will do a very thorough report, which I think the regulations call for. And he can do it in a way, if he wants to, that makes it easier for Barr to release it to the public.
Will we see Bob Mueller testify in front of Congress?
It's certainly possible. So I think, there'll be pressures against that because of privilege and so on.
Right.
But all of those pressures, and this is one of the reasons the regulations initially said confidential, there are protections like 60 grand jury material, sources and methods and the like. We're in a different world than when those regulations were written, because the Republicans have pierced all of that stuff. They've turned over Fast and Furious information, FISA surveillance warrants and the like. So there will be a lot more pressure on Mueller to give all of the information to Congress.
And Saul, what does Bill Barr do when the president says he wants to read the report?
I think it's perfectly fine if the president reads the report.
Before Congress or anybody else sees it?
I don't see any problem with that. The problem will be if the president orders Barr to do or not to do something about the report. That's when you'll have a problem, and I don't think Barr will stand for that.
Neil Katyal, Saul Weisenberg, thank you for providing some expertise to what is a very confusing situation sometimes. Thank you, guys. Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.